We are well aware that the cost of living is jumping up, with the Taoiseach Micheál Martin saying he's going to have a plan ready by the end of the week to address it. But what should be in that plan and what should be up for consideration? For more on this, I'm joined by Paul Murphy, People Before Profit TD, and Edgar Morgenroth, Professor of Economics at DCU. And Paul, let me start with you. There have been suggestions ranging from scrapping the USC through to subsidising fuel. Among the list, what is it that you would seek?
Yeah, I mean, everybody knows now that there is a cost of living crisis. I mean, an average household between rent, oil or gas, electricity, groceries, transport might see their costs go up this year about €2,000. So that is a crisis. And so far, all the government has announced are like tiny sticking plasters on a gaping wound. €100 here is completely inadequate. I think key things that need to be done. The government has the power to introduce price controls. So, for example, to say in relation to electricity, to say in relation to oil and gas, that we're going to impose a maximum price cap on these essentials while we invest in a rapid transition to renewable energy, retrofitting homes and everything else. The government should do that immediately. A second thing we would say is that the minimum wage needs to rise. I mean, the minimum wage went up by 2.9% when inflation is running at over 5%. That's a pay cut. But that also goes for workers who aren't on the minimum wage. But 1 in 10 workers are on the minimum wage, 1 in 5 workers are low paid. And we would encourage workers to take action themselves, if the government isn't going to do it, to put in pay claims above the rate of inflation to mean that they aren't paying the price.
And you wanted to go up to what, Paul?
Well, I mean, I'll give you the example of Dunnes Stores workers put in a pay claim successfully and won it of 10%. So they'll stay ahead of the rate of inflation. And the point I would make in all of this is that...
But sorry, as a policy term, if you're looking at a policy raise for the minimum wage, what is it that you would want it to go to?
So we have a motion proposed by Mick Barry in the Dáil this week, which will propose that there's an emergency review set up and that at least it would meet the rate of inflation. But really what we think it should be going up to is €15 an hour. I mean, if you look, they announced this week that the first affordable one-bed apartment under the cost rental scheme is going to be €1,000. It's just not.
From what? It's currently what, €10.90? Is that the current minimum wage?
That's right.
So that's nearly a 50% increase in the minimum wage. As laudable as that might be from the perspective of those who are on it, you can almost hear the employers whose wage bill is made up, which, for those employers who are of this genre, whose wage bill may be made up predominantly by people on the minimum wage, saying, well, that will just simply cripple us.
Yeah, and they will say the same about energy price controls, for example. But the point,
but what if they're right?
There's a struggle to be waged over who pays for this cost of inflation. At the moment, what is happening is employers are passing on the full costs to the consumers and are maintaining very healthy profit margins. So a lot of those companies you would associate with these rising prices at the moment, Energia, Shell, BP, Tesco's, are all announcing very, very large profits, large dividends to shareholders and so on. So this is about who pays the price for it. So one way we can say that ordinary people shouldn't pay the price is through price controls.
But to go to the second, whatever about the price controls, because then you find yourself in legal matters with significant PLCs. But fine, let's just park price controls for one second.
There's no legal matter in relation to price controls. The government has the power to do it 100%. But in terms of,
I think it's highly unlikely, Paul, that if you did it, that you wouldn't get some kind of opposition through the courts, whether or not that was successful. But putting that to one side, what about the situation where a minimum wage applies and you would have private employers, often small and medium businesses, who would go to the wall if you hike their bills by 50%?
Well, we would be looking to assist small businesses, there's no question. But when it comes to big employers, what has happened in this country across most of the world over the past 20 or 30 years is there's been a significant shift in the amount of the share of the total wealth created in this country on a yearly basis, the proportion of that going to labour, going to wages, versus going to profit. For example, in Ireland, it's fallen from about 70% going to labour about 20 years ago to about 50% now. So there's been a a victory for profit and capital and business at the expense of workers. And this is actually a moment when there is a labour shortage, when workers can get organised, can fight back, and can actually try and claw some of that back in trying to keep up with and hopefully stay ahead of the rate of inflation.
Stay with me, Paul, because as I mentioned, I'm joined by Edgar Morgenroth, who is Professor of Economics at DCU. And can I get you, Edgar, to address that suggestion by Paul Murphy, particularly relating to the minimum wage? Because the people who are most pinched by the cost of living increases are those who can least afford it, many of them on the minimum wage. At first glance, it would seem to be a good solution to that, wouldn't it?
Yes, of course, and you're quite right. The people on the lower incomes and those that are relying on the state and social welfare and state pensions, for those groups, the increases that we've seen recently are particularly difficult to accommodate. Whereas people who are richer, having higher incomes, probably have some spare income that they can use to pay for those increases. So that I think on the face of it, it looks quite right. The one thing, though, that I would point to is that these increases that we've seen lately, rate of inflation at 5.5% up to the end of the last year, are principally driven by energy prices. And energy prices go up and they go down. So during the first part of the pandemic, we actually saw those prices go down. I can't remember Paul saying that we should reduce the minimum wage at that time. And so that's one of the issues here, that, yes, we can raise our costs, but that will have implications.
But what of Paul's point, particularly relating to energy prices, where he is saying that one of the things you can do is you can cut the top off the peak by setting in place price controls?
Again, I think it may in principle be legal to do so, but if you tell a company that it must sell below the costs, then it's going to go out of business and not supply anymore. And those are the sort of things that we've seen actually. If you go far enough back during the oil price crisis, I can certainly remember there being queues at petrol stations where there was just nothing to be had. And we ended up, certainly in Germany, Sundays you weren't allowed to drive even because there wasn't any fuel around. So it's all very nice talking about these things when you don't have to implement them. Practical terms, that's not actually going to work.
So what will?
What will? So I have one suggestion which is specifically aimed at those that aren't earning income at the moment, those on social welfare, and I guess those with the state pension. We do have a welfare system for those lowest income groups, and that includes a fuel allowance. And I would devise a system where the fuel allowance would go up when the price of energy goes up and goes down when the price goes down, so that those people are insulated from the vagaries of the world energy market. And
now, does that insulate them purely from the cost when it comes to heating their own homes? Because the world energy market feeds into the pricing of a lot more than just the direct oil, gas, petrol.
It does, but when you look at the inflation figures, for example, when you look at food and non-alcoholic beverages, inflation is 1.6%, not 5.5%. The other thing I should point out, in terms of wages getting ahead or sort of catching up with inflation that Paul is referring to, up to the third quarter of last year, wage inflation was actually running ahead of inflation in consumer prices. So there is actually a sense in which the wages were rising faster than prices. We don't have the data yet for the last quarter, but with a shortage in staff, including in the sort of more lower skilled or lower paid areas, the wages will actually rise automatically.
A lot of text coming in on this. Edgar saying, if you price cap fuel, oil companies, this is in agreement with your point, oil companies will not supply. Crude has increased $11 per barrel, heading to $100 per barrel. So you can cap pump prices. Oil companies will not supply. If you increase minimum wage, the cost will be passed on to the consumer, increasing inflation, or companies go bust. Another saying, I run a small business employing 22 people. If minimum wage went to €15 an hour, I would close down next week. Another, I'm a farmer. I can't get anyone to work even at the minimum wage. Increasing wages to €15 an hour would effectively finish me off and pave the way for bigger farms to take over. People don't want to work anyway. It's not just me. Talk to anyone trying to hire. They can't get anyone to work. In the context of text like that, Paul, would the low-hanging fruit not be to go for something like what Edgar is saying and peg the fuel allowance to the actual cost of fuel?
Sure. But the problem is that only covers 400,000 people. There are other things that we would campaign for. For example, cutting the VAT for households on energy at this time, scrapping the carbon tax, for example, which makes up a large part of the cost for people. But a problem with, I think, a lot of what the texters are saying is that they're taking for granted that the companies just are going to keep whatever level of profits that they're making now. So last week, Shell and BP both had annual reports and projecting what they were expecting to make in profits this year. And between them, they're expected to make 40 billion euros in the context of this crisis where, yes, the cost of oil and so on has gone up substantially. So it isn't just a zero-sum game. There are big profits still being made by the companies that are passing on these costs.
But hang on, but just so that I can get my head around it, Paul, as I understand it, therefore, let's imagine I am oil company A, and you price cap me, and I say, right, for the cost to the consumer, I will make a loss on every unit of energy that I sell to that individual. I will not supply until that cap goes away, regardless of my global profitability.
But do you think that they're currently not making any profit? Because I'm just telling you that they're making massive profits. Their profits are increasing. So actually they can sell at a lower cost than they're currently selling while still making a profit. I mean, I would go on to make a more fundamental point that I think the idea that our whole world and the future of our global civilization depends upon these private companies which are sitting on literally trillions of euros of fossil fuels that they want to burn in order to make profits doesn't make any sense. We should have big oil, big gas companies in public ownership, in democratic control, so we can plan. But even in the framework of they're currently making very substantial profits and price controls could be imposed, which would still see them making profits, but see them making less profits. And
so you're saying that the critical thing would be to peg the price control so that they are still incentivized by making some element of profit directly from the Irish consumer?
I'm saying you can impose price controls, and it doesn't mean that they're all just going to flood out of the market. Obviously, they want people to think that because they want to continue to make the very substantial profits that they're currently making.
Can I go back to what you said about the VAT and the carbon tax? Because oddly, it strikes me that they would disproportionately or unfairly advantage the wealthy. Because if you cut the carbon tax and I'm a high energy consumer, I benefit greatly from that, even if I'm rich, in an attempt to help everybody.
It doesn't disproportionately, no, because, and it's the point that was made earlier, actually, if those who are on lower incomes spend a much higher proportion of their income on high inflation items, for example.
Indeed, but my point being, from a state subsidy, you will actually subsidise me more if I'm a high energy consumer.
But no, proportionally, the benefit, it would be a progressive move. The benefit would go to low income earners. Obviously, separately, you know that we're in favour, for example, of a higher rate of income tax on those earning over 100,000 euros. We're in favour of a millionaire's tax on net assets exceeding €1 million. So any benefit to the very wealthy that would accrue there, you know, we think would be gotten back through progressive taxation.
Briefly before we go, what's your view on the USC?
We're opposed to the USC. We campaigned for the abolition of the USC, and we would replace the USC with what we call a high income social charge, which would apply to incomes only over 80,000 euros a year. And that would, any income under 80,000, people wouldn't be paying it. I mean, it was a measure that was brought in, linked to the crisis of 2007, 2008, etc.
Paul
ever
Murphy,
selected. Exactly.
thank you very much. That is Paul Murphy, People Before Profit TD, and thanks as well to Edgar Morgenroth, who is Professor of Economics at DCU. And the reason I ask about the USC is a lot of text coming in the lines of, to me, the most sensible thing to do is just scrap the USC for anybody earning less than 100k. Surely that helps most people, I think, and lots more. And lots of people saying that they are personally experienced the kind of price inflation that we've been discussing.